Across Canada, different levels of government, the country's biggest banks, many private businesses have announced mandatory vaccine policies stating employees must be fully vaccinated before they can return to the office. So this obviously has raised a number of questions about enforcement, right? And what happens if an employee remains unvaccinated? With a closer look at the issues, I'm joined by Daniel Lublin, an employment lawyer. Nice to have you back on the show.
Thanks for having me. Good morning.
All right, let's get right to it. Can an employer fire you if you decide you do not want to get vaccinated?
An employer can't force you to put a needle in your arm, but they can make your continued employment conditional on having received a vaccine. And for those employees who choose not to vaccinate, they can be fired. However, in my opinion, in almost all of those cases, almost all, they should be paid severance.
Okay, so you say there have been a number of cases where employees have been terminated for not getting vaccinated. We're likely to see a lot more of that, I'm assuming. What legal options do employees have if that happens?
Well, let's start with whether or not an individual was terminated, and if so, whether or not they were paid severance. That's the really interesting and potentially perplexing legal question. I am seeing many instances where companies are using mandatory vaccination policies as an excuse to get rid of problematic employees and not pay them severance, and that's where I think there are cases. If you're going to introduce a mandatory vaccination policy, there's a way to do it without trampling on employee rights. The policy should be clear, they should be given with notice, and individuals should know what their options are, and probably, if they don't want to vaccinate, there's a case for severance.
Okay, so let's talk about exemptions, Daniel. We know there are medical exemptions. People allergic to ingredients in the vaccine, people who experience severe allergic reactions for heart inflammation after their first dose. And there's also religious exemptions. Actually, there are not that many religions that are strictly anti-vax, but what kind of proof do you think companies will and can ask their workers to produce?
This is where things are getting interesting. Traditionally, a doctor's note has been sufficient and satisfactory proof to demonstrate that you have an illness or medical condition that requires some form of accommodation. However, for whatever reason, when it comes to vaccination, I'm seeing a lot of employers question the legitimacy of some doctor's notes. In my view, that's not how the human rights law should be interpreted. If you can find a doctor that can verify that you have a legitimate medical condition that requires some form of accommodation, I think the analysis stops there and you should be provided with that accommodation.
What if an employee provides an exemption and they are still laid off with severance? Is there any course of action they can take?
Absolutely. That would be a discriminatory termination. An individual could sue for both wrongful dismissal and human rights damages. And in human rights courts, in addition to receiving wage loss recovery, you can potentially sue for reinstatement with back pay.
Daniel, it's important to note in Canadian law, safety trumps privacy, right? Is that right? So in the future, do you predict a lot of cases being thrown out, or do you think the courts will side with employees as opposed to employers?
Well, I'm really excited to see how this is going to play out, and it's going to take some time for these types of cases to wind their ways through the system. But I think it's going to come down to this. It's going to be very industry specific. In certain industries, such as healthcare, there's probably a far greater case to be made for mandatory vaccinations. But in other industries where you can have adequate social distancing and employees can work remotely or on a hybrid basis, it may be more difficult for employers to uphold hardcore mandatory vaccination policies.
All right, it's going to be an interesting road, that's for sure. Thanks for joining us this morning, Daniel. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.